There's times to hit back and there's times to talk, and right now is the time to talk.
Canada and the United States were once almost inseparable, two neighbors, two economies, one breath. But today, a new fault line runs between them. This time, it is not political or military. It is trade.
Now to the impact of Donald Trump's global trade war. The U.S. president just signed off on 25% tariffs on medium and heavy truck imports starting next month.
The Canadian government has unexpectedly announced a decision that could overturn not only bilateral relations, but also the entire balance of power in the global economy. From now on, Chinese goods will enter the country with reduced tariffs, while American goods will face increased duties. This is not just a technical change in the trade tariff table. It is a signal, a harsh, cold, and deliberate signal to Washington. We are no longer playing by your rules. What caused this reversal? Just a few years ago, Canada was one of the pillars of the Western coalition against Chinese industrial dominance. Canadian tariffs on Chinese steel and aluminum were introduced almost simultaneously with the measures taken by Joe Biden's administration. At the time, Ottawa spoke of protecting its manufacturers and coordinating with allies. Now, it's the opposite.
We're engaged in deep negotiations, intensive negotiations on several sectors of the Canadian economy: energy, aluminum, and the steel sector.
Why? The answer is not so simple. Canada's economy is under serious pressure. Inflation, rising housing prices, and a slowdown in industry are all pushing the government to look for new sources of growth. And it seems that these sources are now being sought not in Washington, but in Beijing. The decision to lower tariffs for China seems pragmatic. Chinese steel and electronics are cheaper than American ones. Construction companies, developers, and major infrastructure players are already welcoming the government's move. They will get cheap materials and be able to implement projects faster. But there is a downside. The Canadian steel industry warns of job losses and calls this move a gift to Beijing.
Now there are exemptions for vehicles compliant with a CUSMA free trade agreement. But there are new questions over Canada's response to tariff threats. Mackenzie Gray joins us from Ottawa. Mackenzie, it appears the Carney government has quietly dropped more levies.
And what about the US? For Washington, this sounds like a slap in the face. Against the backdrop of growing tensions in the Pacific region, where Washington is trying to create an anti-China economic belt, Canada is suddenly falling out of line. American analysts are already calling this move the most risky decision by the Canadian government in decades. Rumor has it that the White House is discussing possible retaliatory measures, ranging from additional tariffs to revising certain provisions of the USMCA agreement. But perhaps Ottawa is deliberately escalating the situation. Perhaps Canada is trying to show that it no longer wants to be the junior partner of the American economy, that it is ready to play on its own even if it means flirting with Beijing. However, such independence could come at a high price. Rising prices for American goods will hit consumers, and deteriorating relations with its main trading partner could upset the already fragile balance of the Canadian economy. Today, Canada stands on the brink between profit and dependence, between independence and the risk of isolation. This decision could mark the beginning of a new era in its foreign policy, or the beginning of the end of its economic tectonic. Why did Canada decide to take this step? And how will it all end?
We're going to see a spike of Chinese steel in the country, which is not good because we need to decouple from China, and we've been on the right path, but this is not helpful right now.
The world is once again plunging into a whirlwind of trade conflicts, and it seems that this time Canada finds itself at the center of global turbulence. Until recently, Ottawa stood shoulder to shoulder with Washington, following its line against economic pressure from China. But now everything has changed. Against the backdrop of a slowing global economy and growing distrust of American industrial policy, Canada has unexpectedly taken a step that many are already calling a historic turnaround. Lowering tariffs on China while simultaneously raising duties on American goods was not just an economic decision, it was a diplomatic and strategic challenge to an old ally. To understand how Canada got to this point, we need to remember how it all began. In 2018, Donald Trump's administration declared a trade war on virtually the entire world, including its closest partners. Trump imposed 25% tariffs on steel and 10% on aluminum, explaining this as a matter of national security. Canada was also hit, despite its status as one of the United States' most reliable partners in NATO. Ottawa responded in kind, imposing retaliatory measures on American goods, from steel and aluminum to household appliances, wine, and even motorcycles. These steps were painful but were seen as a temporary measure, a kind of economic defense, until Washington softened its position.
A lot of the steel that we receive in Canada, what we import in Canada, 80% of it could be replaced with Canadian steel.
When Joe Biden came to power, hopes for a normalization of relations grew. He promised to restore allied ties, strengthen North American cooperation, and create a green trade belt. But the promises were followed by new barriers. In 2021, the US adopted a subsidy package for its green industry, effectively excluding Canadian manufacturers from it. The Buy American program once again reinforced protectionism, and Canadian suppliers began to lose contracts even in sectors where they previously had guaranteed positions. This came as a shock to Ottawa. Meanwhile, China, experiencing a slowdown in growth, was looking for new markets for its products and began to insistently offer Canada mutually beneficial cooperation. Beijing promised investments in infrastructure, lower logistics costs, and access to rare earth metals, which are so necessary for the development of Canadian energy and technology. In 2024, on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum in Davos, representatives of the Chinese Ministry of Commerce held several closed meetings with the Canadian delegation. At the time, almost no one talked about them, but as sources in Parliament now claim, that is where the rapprochement began.
The negotiations are at an intense phase. It's a complex negotiation.
When, in early 2025, the American side again raised the issue of restrictions on imports of Canadian aluminum and pure lithium, Ottawa's patience ran out. From that moment on, the course became clear. In April, the first rumors of a tariff policy review began to circulate. Officially, the government explained everything by the need to redistribute trade flows and ensure stability of supply. However, there was something more behind this wording, a desire to show the US that its economic pressure was no longer working. The decision to lower tariffs for China was the culmination of this process. For many analysts, it came as a shock. Just 6 months ago, Canada, together with Washington, was calling for restrictions on Chinese steel imports, and now it had opened its doors. The new package of measures included about 80 product categories for which tariffs were reduced or completely abolished. These included construction steel, aluminum profiles, household appliances, and components for solar panels. The official press release spoke of supporting sustainable development and stimulating competition, but unofficially, officials acknowledged that the decision was dictated by the need to reduce the cost of infrastructure projects and revive the construction sector, which had stalled after a drop in demand.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
At the same time, tariffs on American goods increased. This was especially true for products for which Canada has its own equivalents: recycled aluminum, iron structures, and industrial machinery. Some analysts called it an economic manifesto of independence. Washington perceived the move as an unfriendly act, and the American media lashed out with criticism, saying that Ottawa had betrayed the principles of North American unity for the sake of Chinese steel. In Canada, the reaction was mixed. The Builders Association called it an opportunity for revival, as cheap materials from China promised to accelerate major projects in Vancouver, Calgary, and Toronto. However, metalworkers' unions staged protests outside the Parliament building, warning that thousands of jobs would be at risk. Some economists argue that in a year or two, the country will face deindustrialization if cheap imports replace local production. But the government thinks otherwise. One advisor, speaking on condition of anonymity, said that Canada is not going to become a factory dependent on American orders and is now looking for a hybrid model of an open economy where China is a partner, not a competitor.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
This statement is perhaps the most accurate reflection of the new thinking in Ottawa. The Canadian elite realizes that the era of unconditional dependence on the U.S. has come to an end. After several years of trade conflicts and unequal agreements, Canada has decided to go it alone and for the first time. This is a risky move, and everyone understands that. The US remains the largest buyer of Canadian products, especially energy resources. Any deterioration in relations could hurt exports of oil, gas, and electricity, but the political gamble has already been made. Interestingly, within America itself, this situation is causing irritation but also respect. Some commentators on CNN and Bloomberg note that Canada is acting in its own interests for the first time in a long time, rather than following American instructions. However, other voices are also being heard in Congress. If Ottawa does not review its policy, the US may recalculate all privileges under the USMCA trade agreement. According to Canadian sources, it is precisely because of this threat that negotiations on a number of energy projects have been frozen.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
While politicians argue business is already adapting, Canadian companies have begun to actively seek partners in Asia. Chinese suppliers have started opening offices in Montreal and Edmonton, offering long-term contracts for the supply of metal and equipment. Even Japanese and South Korean corporations have shown interest, seeing Canada as a convenient springboard for access to the North American market, albeit with new rules of the game. But behind all this economic logic lies the main question: how far is Canada willing to go? Experts warn that lowering tariffs for China could cause a chain reaction. If Beijing gains an advantage in the Canadian market, the US may respond in kind, raising tariffs on Canadian goods, restricting access to government procurement, and possibly reviewing Canada's participation in certain defense programs. This would not be just an economic conflict, but a real test of alliance commitments.
Well, when U.S. officials talk, we need to make sure that we listen.
I spoke to Governor Trudeau on numerous occasions, and we'll see what happens, but it just sets up so good for them. Look, the people would pay much less tax than they're paying right now. They'd have perfect military protection.
No one knows how this story will end. But one thing is clear: Ottawa's decision is symptomatic of a deeper trend, the weariness of a middle-sized country with the dictates of a superpower. For the first time in many years, Canada has chosen defiance over caution. And whatever the outcome, this choice has already changed the architecture of North American trade. Today, a barrier has grown between the two closest neighbors, made of tariffs, mistrust, and the desire to be heard. And if the world is entering an era of new economic multipolarity, then this step by Canada can be considered its first loud declaration of independence. Canada's new tariff decisions were not just an economic move, but a full-fledged political manifesto. When the government announced a reduction in duties on Chinese steel, aluminum, and construction materials, while simultaneously increasing them on American goods, it had the effect of a grenade going off. Economists spoke of a quiet revolution in the country's trade policy, industrialists spoke of a betrayal of national interests, and ordinary citizens spoke of the possibility of finally being able to breathe a little easier amid rising prices. But behind this seemingly pragmatic decision lies a much deeper conflict between economic dependence, ideological commitments, and the basic desire to survive in a world where even the closest allies act on the principle of every man for himself.
Economic force, because Canada and the United States, that would really be something. So I think Canada is going to be a very serious contender to be our 51st state.
From an economic point of view, Ottawa's move can be called rational. Canada was in dire need of reducing the cost of construction and infrastructure projects. After the pandemic, housing prices reached record levels, and even large developers began to scale back their construction programs. Chinese materials proved to be a lifesaver, cheap, affordable, and ready for delivery. Immediately after the announcement of the new tariff package, the largest construction companies reported an 8 to 12% reduction in project costs. In Vancouver and Toronto, there was talk of resuming frozen social projects, including public housing for the elderly and the restoration of bridges in the province of Ontario. At first glance, it looked like a victory for common sense.
An attack of any sort on this country is an attack on Canada as a member of the NATO alliance.
But the industrial sector saw this decision as a threat. The Canadian steel industry, concentrated in Hamilton and Sudbury, is already operating at full capacity, and now it will face competition that is impossible to resist. Manufacturers claim that Chinese steel is entering the market at dumping prices, and some batches do not even meet North American quality standards. However, the government is turning a blind eye. The main goal is to keep prices down and reassure the construction sector, as it is currently the main driver of economic growth. At the same time, the increase in tariffs on American products has caused a real shock in the business community. Companies that depend on equipment supplies from the US have begun to look for workarounds. Some are transporting goods through Mexico, while others are negotiating with European intermediaries. Queues of trucks have appeared at the border, stuck at customs for several days because the new tariff rates require manual inspection. This slows down deliveries, causes production disruptions, and undermines confidence in trade agreements that have been in place for decades. In some industries, the situation has become critical. For example, in the medical equipment sector, imports from the US accounted for more than 70%, and now clinics are forced to switch to Asian equivalents, which are sometimes inferior in quality.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in US trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Nevertheless, the government is confident that these are temporary difficulties. According to internal data from the Ministry of Finance, by the middle of next year, Canada will be able to reduce its dependence on US supplies by almost 25%, replacing them with Chinese and South Korean ones. It was this forecast that became the internal argument for making a risky decision. However, independent analysts warn that such a strategy could lead to even greater dependence only now on China. One economist, in an interview with Bloomberg, called it shifting the center of gravity from one axis to another. The social consequences are already being felt. Consumers are, of course, happy. Prices for some goods in household appliance stores have fallen by 10 to 15%, and building materials have become more affordable. However, factory workers, on the contrary, are feeling anxious. Layoffs have begun at metallurgical enterprises, and working hours are being reduced. The first strikes have already begun in some regions, with trade unions demanding government intervention and a review of the tariff package. They argue that liberalization is a cover for the blatant surrender of national interests. But the government insists that without temporary relief from Chinese imports, the domestic market simply cannot survive.
And Canada's been tough on the military because they have a very low military cost. They don't allow our banks. Did you know that? Canada does not allow banks to go in.
There is another layer to this story: energy. According to government sources, the reduction in tariffs on Chinese steel is directly linked to plans to build new power transmission lines and modernize oil and gas infrastructure. China has offered to supply not only metal but also ready-made engineering structures, which significantly reduces project timelines. According to some reports, it was this proposal that became the decisive factor. Thus, tariff policy is becoming a tool not only for trade, but also for strategic planning for the future of Canada's energy market. However, the political cost of this economic benefit may prove too high. The US has already expressed its dissatisfaction. American officials in Washington have hinted that, in response, preferences for Canadian agricultural goods may be revised and access to American government procurement reduced. This will hit the farming regions of Alberta and Saskatchewan, where exports to the US are the main source of income. Moreover, several US states have begun to promote initiatives to localize steel procurement, excluding Canadian suppliers.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Meanwhile, China is making the most of the situation. Beijing has publicly welcomed Ottawa's balanced decision and announced the expansion of its investment program in North America. In the first few months after the tariff review, Chinese companies signed contracts to build 2 non-ferrous metal processing plants and a logistics center in Quebec. This sparked heated debate in the Canadian Parliament, with some calling it a breakthrough and others saying it subordinated national security interests to economic gain.
Really build on that relationship, and I think that's why the outcome this week was a positive one. Well, we know that no deal has been struck. We know that negotiations are going ahead in the right direction.
At the societal level, there is a growing sense of uncertainty. People see that the government is trying to keep the economy afloat, but they understand that this course could have consequences comparable to the crisis of the 1970s, when dependence on external markets left Canada without its own instruments of influence. Opinion polls show that 46% of Canadians support lowering tariffs on China, seeing it as a step toward making life more affordable, but 41% express concern that the country is losing control of its industrial policy.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
Analysts are already calculating the economic impact. Short-term GDP growth of 0.7% is expected due to increased consumer spending, but in the long term, a decline in production capacity is forecast. A report by one of Canada's institutes indicates that by 2027, the country could lose up to 12,000 jobs in metallurgy and mechanical engineering. The government, in turn, promises to compensate for the losses by investing in green technologies and renewable energy, but experts doubt that this decision will be able to quickly make up for the lost revenue.